Hello folks, welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our economies and industries series on the channel. And after talking about the Soviet Union and Lend-Lease last time, Denis is back today to talk about the economies of the major combatants. And I'm really pleased with the feedback we got from Larry's appearance yesterday, because I know a lot of people out there in YouTube world, they like hearing about tanks and aircraft and the sinews of war, but I'm finding that the economies and the funding is equally important. So I'm going to bring Denis in now. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Excellent. How are you?
Very well. So, I mean, what have you been up to since I last spoke to you? Because you're busy working on various projects.
Yes, well, life came in a way, working a regular job, but still working on the history department.
Good. So we won't hang about. We'll bring up your PowerPoint and we'll get going. And folks, we'll probably do the questions at the end today because it'll be a shorter presentation than yesterday, but I will address questions as they come along and put some comments up. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Denis to talk about the war economies. So over to you, Denis.
Yes, so the topic of today's video is about war production and the war economy. And as with Lend-Lease, it's not the most sexy topic, but the most important one that gets often neglected. Because when talking about the World War or war in general, people concentrate on the battles, heroics, campaigns, and decisions. But without the diligent factory worker producing all the necessary equipment and ammunition, soldiers would have nothing to fight with or not enough. And here is where the war economy comes into the frame. So basically, our regular economy is it's centered around the desires and needs of the people. People want or need a million things, and they need it in vast quantities. And the purposes of a war economy is nothing else than to convert these production capabilities from consumer products to military equipment. It's the attempt to rationalize the economy in order to maximize weapons output while keeping as much consumer products as possible to keep the population going. And this was the main challenge of the world wars: maximize weapons output while keeping the civilian population supplied with the necessary consumer products. And a struggle it was. Most people cannot even imagine what a struggle, because nowadays we have so much more of everything. Just look at these stats. The average British woman has 14 handbags and buys 3 new ones a year. And the average British woman has 30 to 35 pairs of shoes, and the gents have 18 pairs of shoes. Back in the 30s, it was a tenth. People had 2 or 3 pairs of shoes, 2 or 3 sets of clothing, much fewer things than we have now. And yeah, the war economy, once the war started, reduced this even further. So there was not much to go around. And here, for example, we see the effects of war on Great Britain. This is the civilian consumption of certain consumer products in 1935 and 1943. Same for food. And yeah, let's, for example, boots and shoes. There were 48 million Britons. So before the war, 160 million shoes meant 3 pairs of shoes for every Briton. In 1943, they halved this. Everything that was not necessary went gone. Restaurants, gone. This little boutiques or shops in the city, gone. Everything concerned with tourism, gone. It was everything that was not necessary was gone. And yeah, we see that it was basically before the war, Britain didn't really produce enough consumer products. And after the war, it was basically non-existent. Like ladies' handbags, the item all the way down, 10 million for 20 million ladies was 1 handbag for every, not much. And then in 1943, 1 million for 20 million ladies. So if people were lucky, they got 1 or 2 new items during the war every year. This was roughly the same in Germany, a little better in Canada and the US, infinitely worse in the Soviet Union. The Soviets basically stopped producing consumer products at the end of 1941. And yeah, this is the effects of war people don't talk about. Same for foods. For example, before the war, the average Briton got a little more than 3 eggs per week. Once the war started, or in the middle of the war, it was 1.5. And yeah, this was just to show the effects of the war economy on civilian consumption. And now we come to the core of the presentation. And this is Am I still there?
Yep, still here. Yep.
Yes. So surprisingly and perplexingly, the Allies, and especially the Western democracies, were willing to make greater sacrifices than a German dictatorship, or were far more energetic in organizing their war economy. It's not so surprising for the Soviets. They were a brutal dictatorship, but it's really surprising that the Western democracies did better than the Germans. And yeah, as we can see, the Germans didn't really start until 1942 to really switch to a war economy, and there were no serious attempts until 1943. And I know many people will disagree. Oceans of ink have been written about this topic, because nowadays the consensus seems to be that the Germans did everything they could, but that they were mismanaged from 1939 to 1942. But when presented with the evidence, this doesn't hold up. Because, for example, we can see here, in April 1942, 90% of the German armament industry was working just one shift. This was 3.5 years after the start of the war, just one shift, which is insane. Yeah, it was so much wasted potential here. And the second thing is part of a speech from Albert Speer from October 1943, where he complains how many luxury products the economy still produces. He complains about the civilian economy. Something like, I think, 50,000 houses and apartments were built in 1943. And this is for the army, for example. In 1943, for example, the army produced 512,000 pairs of riding boots in a year. Then he goes on, and then he says in frustration, I really don't know what they used them for. It's bizarre. This was simply incompatible with fighting a world war. Or all the way down, Germany was producing 4,800 tons of hair tonic during a world war. This was just absolutely absurd. There are several reasons for this, though. All of the Allies had a major shock moment, which forced them to switch to a war economy as quickly as possible. Britain had Dunkirk and the fall of France. Immediately after this, the economies reorganized. 2 shifts were introduced in the factories. And the British were in a battle of survival, so they did everything they could to mobilize their economy. Same goes for the Soviets. They, in June 1941, they shipped all their factories to the Urals, or at least behind Moscow. They built mega factories where 20, 30,000 people could work. They introduced 12-hour workdays, and people basically worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And the Americans had Pearl Harbor. Immediately after this, the economy was reorganized. By the summer of 1942, 4 million Americans were already working in the night shift. And yeah, the Germans, they didn't have such a crisis until Stalingrad. There was the first 3 years of war. Of course, they had setbacks, the Battle of Britain or the Battle of Moscow, some setbacks in North Africa, but no catastrophic defeat that really required an increase in war production. For example, when Speer wanted to increase production in 1942, in early 1942, Luftwaffe General Jeschonek commented that I would not know what to do with 360 new fighters a month. And by this time, the Germans should have built twice or thrice this number to even stand a chance. And yes, the reason for German inactivity was that the Nazis were traumatized by World War I, where the German army, it's the myth that it's a stab in the back, and the rebellions, the communist rebellions, the home front collapsed. So what does this mean? This means keep the living standard of the Germans high. And that means, of course, because food was tight, consumer product was tight. So if anyone would starve, it would be the enemy or the occupied peoples, not the Germans. So all of Europe was plundered for food and consumer products, and these were shipped to Germany, so that the Germans were kept relatively happy, or at least complacent. And another reason are the manpower requirements of the Eastern Front, which were absolutely insane and basically forced the Germans to mobilize more men into the army than they should have, which we can see here. So as a rule of thumb, a country should have a maximum of 10% of its population drafted in the army at any moment. Every number over these 10% endangers the functioning of the war production and of the country in general, because there's basically no one left who can run not only the factories, but the few bakeries that are left, the infrastructure, the trains, etc. And as we can see, in 1943, Germany had a population of roughly 80 million, and they already 9.5 million were in the armed forces. This is already 12%. This is 1.5 million people too much. And these 1.5 million people were missing the factories. Britain, for example, was at just 10%, was on the limit, at the limit. The USSR also 10%, 12 million. The population, 120 million, here is written because by this time millions had already died, and several dozen billion were living under German occupation. But the interesting thing is, the more territories the Soviets freed, they did not increase the size of the army, because they drafted these people into agriculture or war production to increase their production numbers. And yes, the Americans, roughly 135 million, and in 1943 their armed forces were even smaller than the German armed forces, so they had less than 7% in the armed forces, which of course was a luxury, because they then could invest all this manpower into war production. And yes, and manpower is basically the most important resource during war, because if you have a low intensity conflict, you can choose where to invest this manpower. And the Germans were forced to draft so many soldiers away from the industry, agriculture, science, that it was hampering their war effort. Just as an example, here an effect of manpower shortages on the German flag. In the first half of the war, they needed just 3,500 rounds of ammunition to down an enemy aircraft. This is for heavy flak ammunition, so from the 88 millimeter and onwards. By 1944, they needed 16,000 rounds to down an enemy bomber, because by this time, roughly 1/3 of the flak personnel were professionals. The other 2/3 were prisoners of war or forced conscripts or boys, and it decreased the efficiency. Another interesting factor to show as an example, the Germans until 1945 did only have a time fuse. So they basically, it was a timer set to 10 or 20 seconds, and the shell exploded after this time. And it happened thousands of times that the shell went right through the bomber, exploded 2 or 3 seconds later, which saved thousands of aircraft. And the Germans were working to improve the numbers on a dual time and impact fuse, which also exploded on impact. And this decreased the ammunition numbers needed in the last months of the war to 5,000. The thing is, they could have had this technology much earlier, because they already started in December 1942 to develop it. But for example, they needed 600 specialists, or wanted 600 specialists to develop it. But because of the requirements of the Eastern Front, by March 1943, only 200 had been freed from their duty. And this was a problem throughout the entire war. I don't know, the gentleman yesterday, did he mention the British-American proximity fuse?
We did cover that, yeah.
Yes, this was also one of the things. This was even better than the time impact fuse. This increased the number of shot down bombers 3 times. The proximity fuse was perhaps some claim, besides the atom bomb, one of the greatest achievements of the Allies. It basically increased the number of shot down aircraft 5 to 10-fold. And this was also only possible because the Allies were free to invest this manpower into science and engineering and research, instead of having to have gigantic armies. And yes, we go further, which is a discussion, an age-old discussion apparently, which is more important, manpower or material? And modern Western historians concentrate on production and material while neglecting manpower. For example, the American historian O'Brien calculated that because the Western Allies were destroying a majority of the German Air Force, Navy, and ammunition, and here we can see in October 1942, for example, these 3 items were 80% of German war production. In May 1943, there were 75. They were much more important than the Soviets. But what this neglects is, manpower. For example, with the USSR out of the picture in 1942 or 3, the Americans and British would have to raise much larger armies, especially for ground warfare. And this means less production, more casualties, and they require more replacements. And as we can see here, Soviets basically freed Allied manpower, because as we can see, the Allies had in northwestern Europe in November 1944. This excludes the British Islands and Italy. This is just Western Europe, basically. The Americans in November 1944 had I say just because their army was much larger, 1.9 million boots on the ground. The British just 800,000 and 120,000 Canadians. Together, this was 2.8 million. The Soviets had 6.8 million people or soldiers, active soldiers by this time on the front. And yeah, they basically saved the Americans and British from having to create armies that are far too large and that would have required to take people from the production boards. It basically means the fantastic production numbers of the Americans were paid for with Soviet blood. And because here we see the total population and total number of drafted during the entire war. And as we see, Germany had 80 million population. It drafted 18 million into the army. That's 22.5%. The British just 6 million. That's a third. The Americans, despite having a much larger population, did draft 1.5 million people less into the army. So, of course, they had fantastic number. If relative to their population size, they had to draft much fewer soldiers because they then could invest this manpower into the factories. And yeah, for the USSR, we have 34 million drafted. It's 17.4 to 20% because they started out the war with 195 million, and most of the war, they did not have access to this number, but it was actually less. And yes, for example, Major Wiedemeyer, a U.S. Army major, made in his victory program, that was a study conducted in 1941. He estimates that in the event of a Soviet surrender, the Allies would have to raise an army of 25 million men to defeat the European Axis. And these were just number. If the Americans and British have drafted so many people, then their production numbers would have been 1/3 or 1/2 less. It was just manpower. In a war economy, manpower is the most important thing. And the Soviets basically freed the Americans and British to invest theirs into war production. And yeah, we're nearing the end here. And this is to once again address the people saying that basically Germany did everything it could in 1939, 40, 41. If we look at the production numbers, it becomes apparent that they basically didn't. They basically were complacent in these first 2 years. Because the British, for example, they increased their tank production 6-fold, the Soviets 9-fold, the Americans 60-fold. The Germans didn't even manage to quadruple theirs. Same for aircraft production. The Americans went from 13,000 to 48,000. The British from an already high 15,000 to 24. The Germans produced not even 5,000 more aircraft in 1942 than in 1940. And this was basically because the Allies were much better and much quicker in mobilizing their economies. And because of the Soviets, they had the luxury to invest, especially for the Canadians, Americans, British, most of their manpower into the factories. And if the Germans had really organized their war economy from 1939 energetically, they could have had potentially thousands of extra tanks in 1940-41. Same goes for aircraft. And what effect this would have had on Barbarossa can only be imagined. But the Germans came in 40 kilometers. They were 40 kilometers before Moscow. If they had 1,000 extra tanks or 2,000, 3,000 or 4,000 extra aircraft, they most likely would have taken the city, which again would most likely have meant a Soviet defeat in 1942 or 43. And of course, if they had higher production numbers in 1940, 41, they also would have had higher in 42, 43, 44, and so on. And yes, so ultimately, the Allies switched to a war economy much earlier and much more energetic. Germany basically wasted the years 1940-41. And once it switched to a war economy, it was hampered by Allied bombing and the manpower requirements of the Eastern Front. It was already far too late. The Americans and British production numbers were paid for with Soviet and Chinese blood. Soviets, a majority of the manpower requirements of the Germans went to the Eastern Front. 3/4 of all casualties were on the Eastern Front. For the Pacific, it's something similar. In 1944, 1.5 million Japanese soldiers were in China, compared to just 750,000 in the Philippines and the Pacific. So basically, at Iwo Jima, there were 100,000 Americans against just 20,000 Japanese. If the Japanese were not engaged in China, then they could have had 100,000 as well, for example, which would have meant the larger casualties for the Americans, more replacements needed, and a larger army to fill in the gaps. And yes, the most perplexing or surprising thing is, funny thing is, the studies done in the 40s, like the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, came to this conclusion 80 years ago. Nowadays, most historians are not of this opinion. But basically, the war was decided because Germany failed to mobilize its war economy in 40-41. And if they had done so, it could have altered the war, or at least some aspects of it. And this shows the importance of a war economy and the management of manpower, because if they had managed this properly, they would have done much better. Or if the Allies had done worse with their management or were not as energetic, they would have done much worse.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Obviously, quite a lot to unpack there. I've got a few questions. I'm sure the viewers have some questions as well. So the first thing is going back to that, the Allied response, the Pearl Harbor, Battle of Britain, etc., is that although that obviously was clearly significant in getting the industry cranking up, getting everything working, people focusing on less consumerism and working for the war effort, but how much of that was down to that? Well, in COVID times, we had that buzz phrase of everybody wanting to be part of the solution, not the problem. And I think when the British were facing the BEF being pulled out of Dunkirk, Americans facing post Pearl Harbor, everybody wants to do something. They all feel they want to participate in something for the country. And if you eventually digging vegetables in your garden, not buying new clothes, all those things that people did, that clearly, as you've made the point, helped the economy recover. But it was also of a psychological comfort to the people themselves. So, and as you made the point, Germany didn't have that crossroads point in their war where they felt as a people they had to do something. So how significant do you think is the psychology behind that, in the people like my grandmother and grandfather in Britain there, that feeling of participation being really important?
Well, it is especially important. That's where we started with the propaganda posters, where you need propaganda in war. But it was much stronger in Britain and the USSR, based on geography, of course, than America. I recall some studies from some polls, Gallup polls from February 1942, that basically shows the Americans by this point, or most Americans by this point, were still indifferent to the war or not really convinced of it. But in case of Britain and the USSR, the psychological effect was huge. And in America, at first, not really, but I think it improved over time.
Okay, thank you. So the next burning question is, why didn't the Third Reich, at the very early stages of planning their conquest, consider more about material and production and the economy? Why did they get it so wrong? Why, for example, the question came up in the sidebar from Gwilym Morgan: wasn't it true that Germany was very slow to mobilize the female population? So why were there not people within the Third Reich, Speer and others, telling Hitler, for goodness sake, we've got to get our economy working and we've got to get our production up?
Well, part of the reason they were winning easily, Poland was basically gone in 6 weeks. The combined forces of Western Europe, again, in 6 weeks. And the stocks which they had in 1940 or 41, for example, were full. So the weapons, even if they produced relatively few weapons, they were mostly sufficient in 1940-41. And then there was, of course, Nazi ideology that women should not be drafted into the armed forces. But eventually they were. I think 500,000 women served in the flag forces. And but you could not draft that much women because they were replacing the men that left the civilian economy, because by 1944, I think 2/3 of all lawyers, of all doctors were female.
No, thank you for that. And Alt92 is saying, this isn't a dig at anybody. So this is, of course, a purely economic history view. Social or cultural historians will have a different slant and opinion, and which I would agree with. You're looking at this from in some ways, a dispassioned economic point of view, but your statistics are very valid there. So, how difficult is it in your case, Denis, to try and simply go with where the statistics lead you, rather than people get very emotional about World War II. Clearly, it was a destructive conflict. Millions died. It raises people's, responses to the tragedy of it. But how difficult is it just kind of crunching the numbers and looking at it from a statistic point of view?
Well, the problem is you can the numbers, you can quantify the numbers. You can't quantify the rest. So it's a quite difficult question.
Yeah, true. I guess it's true, but I mean, it's just interesting. And so we've got a few more questions. So, Ian Carr is asking, did Germany have any build-up of shadow factories before the war? UK have been planning and building for these critical industries from 1935. Good question.
Not before the war. They were building a lot of shadow factories. During the war, they were actually building entire shadow cities to hide their factories and to divert bombing forces.
Okay, thank you. And Susan, does Denis think that keeping the home population complacent has an impact in whether a country supports a war or believes in a war? And this is kind of a deeper question again about the people of Germany looking at the war differently from the people of the Great Britain or the people of the US looking at the war. But what's your response to that?
It plays, it's hard to quantify, but it plays a role, because a country with fewer casualties will support the war for longer. A country which has to make less sacrifices, fewer sacrifices, will support the war longer. That's, for example, in Vietnam, the Americans had eventually to pull out because casualties were mounting. It did not, of course, impact that much the living style of the Americans, but casualties were mounting. If casualties had been a tenth, perhaps, or half, then they would have supported it longer.
Okay, thank you. I wanted, if you could can you bring up the slide where you're asking whether it's men and material? Because Brad from OTD made a comment earlier on, which I'd like you to respond. He said it's definitely both with regards to manpower, material. And Phillips O'Brien, I chatted to him a bit at We Have Ways last year, and he's some people love what he says and other people hate what he says and writes. He's very divisive amongst historians. So I don't know that he's necessarily speaking from a mainstream point of view, but he's definitely got an interesting point of view. But would you agree with Brad that ultimately you have to get the manpower and material correct?
Yes, it's a question. We cannot say how important is manpower or material, but it certainly would help if both are the required or the best possible size.
Brilliant. And anything with regards to this point you're making about the study of the economy, any other conclusions that you think you've come up with in your work, or areas you would like to work on more to invest? I know, we both have read Adam Tooze's fantastic book, Wages of Destruction, but it is now 20 years old, I think, nearly, and probably needs a bit more reevaluation. So where do you think we have uncovered all there is to uncover about the economies of these countries?
I think perhaps the civilian consumption, or how they went through the war with so few. There are books about food, how the civilian population managed with scarce foods to get through the war, but I don't recall any books about how the regular life or the regular people managed to go through the war with getting one pair of shoes every 2 years.
No, that's a very good point, because a few weeks ago I was trying to find, for this series, in fact, I was trying to find people who'd written about rationing. Now, when I meant rationing, I was looking at more from an economic point of view. Now, if you go on Amazon, folks, there's plenty of books of compilations of recipes. There's lots of people who've said this is what people in London were eating, this is what people in Pennsylvania were eating, and here's how they use this, here's how. But they're basically, all I could find was, as I say, recipe books. I couldn't find any literature out there about actually how, for example, the Ministry of Food in the UK is looking at the efficiency of food, how they're looking at if we can make what's the best crop to in terms of efficiency, things like that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in whether or not the country's got it right in terms of how they mobilize their food efforts. I mean, I remember when I'm going off on a tangent now. I was speaking at the National Army Museum in Chelsea years ago about chocolate in World War II. In the UK, chocolate was zoned. And if people didn't know this fact, it meant that in order to not create competition, certain towns would get certain types of chocolate. So Liverpool would get Kit Kats, East End of London would get, Mars bars, Somerset would get so-and-so. And so there was obviously some kind of meeting at the Ministry of Food where they decided that they would put chocolate into zones so to not create this. And it made me wonder how much more information is there out there in various countries about the effort put in to make sure that the feeding process was efficient. But in terms of historians tackling this subject, I can't find very much on it. But anyway, so that was just my point about chocolate there. But with regards to this point of the German and the economy and mobile, was there anybody you think who was trying to get things working differently in Germany, or was it just that everybody was swept up in the ideology and they didn't really notice what was going wrong?
You mean organizing the war economy and manpower?
Yeah. Was there someone who was like an advocate for it who wasn't being listened to, or was it just not being noticed at all by anybody?
Yes, there was, for example, Speer's predecessor, that was Fritz Todt. He was somewhat of an armaments minister before Speer. He tried to organize the economy from 1940-41 onwards, but he was not very popular with the German high command or with the other Nazis, and he died in February 1942. That's when Speer took over. And then there were a few generals. I think this was General Thomas from the Wehrmacht. And there were several from the flag department. I think it was General von Renz, who wanted to rationalize the production of flags and develop new flags. But it was always the problem, that there was no real push or need until 1942. And that once it started, this push, everyone was competing for scarce resources.
Brilliant, thanks. I'm just trying to find if there's any more questions there in the sidebar that I've missed. There's comments. There are no real questions at the moment, except people like the information there. Where's your research going with this in the future? I mean, you say you've got a job now, but what would you like? What is your ambition with this subject?
Well, as I said, to concentrate more on the civilian economy, to write what steps were taken to increase food production, for example, to administer the food efficiently, to make sure that each part of the country was supplied with as much as possible, and how the civilian population basically managed to get through this war. Because as we saw, if nowadays, most people have 20 pairs of shoes at home. So if now, like a Russian-Ukrainian war, if something like that starts and you can't buy new shoes for a year or two, most people would manage. But back 80 years ago, they had 2 or 3 pairs of shoes, for example, and clothing 2 or 3 pairs. So a book about that.
Well, while you were chatting there, a couple of people in the sidebar have talked about raw materials. So we mentioned that when I did the show with about the Japanese economy a few weeks ago. We talked about the Japanese focus on getting to the raw materials they needed, and rubber and zinc and what have you. So Robert's point is, it's a point as well as a question. Discussion of the access to resources is an important missing piece here. The Allies had much greater access, and wasn't that also the reason the war started? So to frame that into a question, Do you think the
Yes,
Third Reich made enough effort to focus on the resource there? We talk about the oil. We always talk about oil when it comes to Germany. We always talk about the synthetic oil, but in terms of the other resources they need, again, is that something that the Third Reich were kind of was an oversight?
Well, not really. As Robert said, yes, a large part or a large reason why the war started were resources or food. But the Germans, of course, when they conquered the various countries, they shipped the weapons back, they shipped the oil back, they shipped the locomotives back, the gold, and everything of value. But there was no proper centralization.
Yeah, no, and Grant is reminding us, our resident Romanian war expert, is Romania is all about the oil there. So I think we'll bring things to an end. It was a short and sweet show because there's lots of data today. I can't wait to invite you back again, Denis, with your next round of research there. But I think the takeaway from this is there's lots more to think about in terms of the statistics and the data here. And again, as I said at the beginning there, we all love our shows about fighter aircraft and secret agents, but the understanding the economies and the financing of the war is also key to understanding how it all went wrong. Oh, one quick question, and then we'll move it. So Peter O'Connor is saying, is it possible to estimate the reserve of potentially unused economic power allied countries, especially the US, could have mobilized if necessary? So, I mean, what we're saying there is the US didn't really ever even reach a peak, did it? I mean, arguably, the US was still cranking its way towards a peak when the war came to an end. I'm thinking of the fact the aircraft are still churning out aircraft, things like that. So did the US get anywhere near close to reaching their maximum?
I can answer that for the UK. The UK basically reached their absolute possible maximum. There was a Manpower survey in 1943, and they needed something like 1.5 million people for that year, and they could come up with just 1 million. So they were scraping the barrel. The British, they could not have found the manpower. They were actually, I think, not the armed forces, the people employed in the industry sector was 100,000 lower at the end of 1944 than at the end of 1943. So for Britain, they did most likely the absolute maximum they could. The Americans had a little more wiggle room. They had still around 1 million unemployed people in 1944. They could have perhaps done 10% more. Because they had a few million, like 1 million unemployed, and some that were not organized properly, and the army was not that big or didn't have to be that big.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, Denis. And folks, if you come back tomorrow, our show tomorrow is earlier than normal time. It's 4 p.m. UK time. We're talking with Oliver about his editorial work with the Never Surrender book, which is a collection of various stories and accounts by authors you know, including Roger Morehouse and Damien Lewis, about various acts of defiance in World War II. So that's at the earlier time of 4 p.m. UK. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks for your support. Again, all the information you need is in the description below. Thank you, Denis, and thank you, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.